Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening if you're in Cape Town, and I'm sure it's good morning if you're in the United States. So today we're having the third in our monthly webinar hosted by the Institute for Democracy, Citizenship, and Public Policy in Africa. We had our first webinar in April, and that was titled Pathways to Autocratization and Democracy. We had Professor Nick Cheeseman and Professor Nick van der Waal. And then in May, we had another event looking at democratic backsliding in Zambia. And we had Listener Rachna, Maya Himfler, and Bonnie Dulani. So today we're having our third event, and this one is titled Presidential Succession and Unexpected Presidential Turnover and Its Consequences in Africa. So we have three eminent scholars who will be talking into this topic today. We'll begin with Yonatan Morse, who's an assistant professor of political science at University of Connecticut. He will be talking mainly about the event following the death of John Magufuli in Tanzania and the implications therefore. He will then be followed by Ken Opalo from Georgetown University. And thirdly, and Ken will be looking at ideology and its implications for turnover in Ethiopia. And then thirdly, we'll be hearing from Michael Wahman, who will talk on turnover in Malawi. So for now, so each of them will have about 15 minutes to make a presentation before we open it up to the floor for a Q&A. And just as a brief introduction from my part, I am Hangala Sechwena. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Institute for Democracy and Citizenship in Africa. So over to you, Yonatan.
All right, thank you. Well, let me share this. Working? Okay, can everybody, is that working?
Yeah.
I can see that. Okay, well, thanks so much, Angala and Matthias, for the invitation. It's great to be here. It's great to see Michael and Ken as well, and for everybody to attend. And so I've been asked to talk about 15 minutes about the unexpected succession in Tanzania. And so I'll talk a little bit about that and kind of tie it into my research about authoritarianism, about ruling parties in Tanzania. So just, it's an unexpected succession. And so just a quick kind of review of the recent timeline that happened earlier this year. February 27 was John Magufuli's last public appearance. It opened up about almost a 3-week period of churning rumor mill until officially on March 17th, it was announced that he had deceased. There was some uncertainty in the public sphere about whether his successor, the Vice President, Samia Suluhu Hassan, would be allowed to succeed him. A 2-day period passed before she was actually sworn in as the 6th president. But then a day later, she's nominated by the Central Committee and the National Executive Committee of the ruling party of CCM to be the party's chairperson. At March 22nd, on her inauguration speech, she makes this point, sorry, at his funeral, not inauguration speech, to say, for those who are doubtful, the person standing in front of you is the president of Tanzania. And she added, and is a woman as well. And then April 30th, at the official meeting of CCM's National Party Congress, she was officially elected to take on the role as CCM's chairperson. So basically solidifying her role as president. And she got to appoint the new Secretary General of CCM as well, Daniel Chongolo. So what does this succession really mean? What does it mean for Tanzania, especially given her predecessor, John Magufuli's controversial tenure? And there's questions about, will this strengthen democracy in Tanzania? Or the way I see it, will this actually strengthen authoritarianism in some ways in Tanzania? And there are different ways to kind of frame this issue. I get to go first, so I get to kind of bring in some of this about term limits. There's one way to frame this debate is within the context of the issue of term limits in Africa. This might not be up to date completely, but there are 16 countries currently that have modified or eliminated term limits. 8 countries have no term limits. 6 countries have tried but failed to modify term limits, leaving just really 14 countries that have adhered to term limits and 10 countries that are really still untested. There is widespread popular support for term limits across Africa and Afrobarometer data. And in Tanzania, it's one of those countries that's marked here sort of in green, where there have been consistently abided by term limits across time. And Tanzanians actually demonstrate an above average support for 2 term limits for the president compared to the average level of support according to Afrobarometer. You can also kind of frame this as understanding the question of presidential succession within the perceived context of what's often framed as democratic backsliding in Tanzania under former President John Magufuli. But I think this depends on a little bit about how you've kind of really viewed the multi-party period in Tanzania beginning in 1995. And so here's some like data from the Varieties of Democracy from VDEM, just some of the major kind of measures of electoral democracy. I'll show a couple others. And it really depends. My viewpoint has already been that Tanzania was not an electoral democracy during this period, but rather a fairly stable, again, the terminology changes here, an electoral authoritarian, a competitive authoritarian type of regime. And the problem is that until recently, elections were not manipulated as overtly as they were under Magufuli. And so you can kind of see that there's been sort of a steady level on the electoral democracy index. If we look at the liberal democracy index, it's about, it's a lower at the beginning, but you can see that kind of small decline starting in 2015 when Magufuli was elected. So you've had clear declines really in freedom of association, freedom of expression. The 2020 election was atrocious, likely blatantly rigged. But here, just looking at the clean elections index from VDEM that kind of measures all kinds of aspects of elections, there's not a huge actually amount of change from 1996 to 2020. And so I would say that under Magufuli, you've actually had, rather than democratic backsliding, you've had authoritarian backsliding, an authoritarian regime resorting to more and more overt forms of repression. And now the question is whether the current president will return to a previous mode of operating, this sort of more, in my book, I call it a tolerant hegemony, or it's not as consistently overt repression of elections. Another way to kind of frame the issue that kind of ties into my research is on the question of, again, whether presidential succession actually leads to autocratic stability. And I approach the fact that, for instance, Tanzania has always had term limits, and it's always been some sort of variant of authoritarianism since 1995. So that really shapes my thinking about it. And the work on this really says that succession, institutionalized succession at the highest level, at the presidency, really comes with a number of stabilizing benefits for authoritarianism. And in some ways, these are actually some of the same benefits when we think about term limits for democracy. There's some of the same advantages for authoritarianism. One is that it forces longer term perspectives, longer time horizons from elites. It encourages them to invest more into the institution of the party and of the regime, as long as they think they have a credible shot of obtaining the presidency when it's that cycle returns to itself when the incumbent is out of office and it's their turn to compete again. Also, by rotating power, it lowers the stakes of holding power, and therefore it sort of neutralizes the influence that any one faction in the party has from becoming dominant and possibly locking other factions out of contesting power. And therefore, it could also really build elite cohesion because it can really limit that idea of factionalism. In the literature on authoritarian politics, we say that institutionalized succession helps with the problem of power sharing in autocracies. But the key for this to work is that you have to play by the rules so that you know that you'll get your chance. And the question is that what happens when people stop playing by those rules? Admittedly, our universe of cases for understanding this type of authoritarianism is fairly slim. Outside of Tanzania and CCM, I would say like the most famous case is probably the Mexican PRI, which held power for 72 years in a very similar manner as CCM. It wasn't a blatant repressor. It was still not a democratic regime, and it regularly rotated the presidency every 2 terms, every 10 years. So to say that, I think we need to understand a bit more how this presidential nomination system occurs in CCM, how has it occurred historically, and my tendency is always to look back in time a bit towards historical precedent, so we can understand how this sort of unexpected succession really makes a difference. And just to preface there, like Suluhu's selection as a president is important because she didn't emerge through the normal channel of selecting presidents in Tanzania. She was the vice president, and so she's the constitutional successor, but that vice presidential candidate is pretty much decided in an informal meeting, not through the straight election. I'll show this process in a second about how people become presidents in Tanzania. And really, this system has been in place since 1985, but really tested since 1995. So there's some basic requirements that you need to run for president in Tanzania. There's an age requirement, there's an education requirement, You have to get a number of signatures from party support, from party members. Party members can only support one candidate. It used to be 250 signatures. Now it's 450. It's not overtly burdensome, 450 signatures. And you have to make a deposit of about 1 million shillings. It's about $450. So not a huge burden. But there's this 3-stage process that happens. So anybody can nominate themselves to be president. But the first phase is that the Central Committee reviews these dossiers, reviews these files. The Central Committee of the party is about 30 to 40 members, depending on what election cycle. And they reduce that number of candidates to just 5. The criteria are a little bit opaque. They've become a bit more transparent and problematic since 2012. Those 5 candidates then go to the National Executive Committee, which is about 300 to 400 people. And they actually have a vote on who the top 3 candidates are going to be. And those 3 candidates move on to the National Party Congress. And here we're talking about 2,000 to 2,200 people. And they elect the presidential candidate in a majoritarian system. So you got to get 50% plus 1 of the vote. So you really have to build consensus within the party Congress. If nobody gets a majority in that first vote, like in any majoritarian system, the bottom candidate drops out and only the 2 top candidates go head to head each other in the next vote. A couple of things that happened since 2012, and this was the system that Nyerere really put in place when he stepped down from power in 1985, is since 2012, you've had this official National Security and Ethics Committee provide an official consultation. Questions of ethics and national security credentials have always been part of the decision-making in the Central Committee, but this has become more official since 2012, where they come up with an official recommendation to the Central Committee. And since 2015, you've also had this informal consultation from the Elders Council, which really just consists of the former presidents and the former vice presidents and vice chairs of the party before. So that's happened really since 2015. Now, those are the rules. So the official rules are there, and that's one way you influence the nomination system in Tanzania. And violating those rules can result in disciplinary action. It's something that happened in 2015. But there's also other ways that you can influence this presidential nomination system. There's a degree of informality, as there is actually in any official kind of institutionalized nomination system. There are norms, for instance, that there always be a Zanzibari and a mainlander amongst the final list of candidates who get selected. There's an informal norm that some candidates are promised temporary positions, even though they know they're going to be nominated, to very popular aspirants to kind of hold them over till the next cycle. There's always sort of been an informal norm that a youth candidate will always be nominated in the top 5 candidates, not always in the top 3, but in those top 5 nominated by the Central Committee. There'll be a sort of an elder statesman, but there'll also be a youth candidate. There's also a way for the party elites to kind of signal their preference through endorsements, through proclamations. Nyerere apparently had the power of fiat, where he could basically say, this person is not qualified to run for president. There are review criteria, which again, were a little bit more opaque through the Central Committee, but now that you have this National Ethics Committee, it's become a little problematic because the criteria, again, are very loose. It's things like the candidate must respect the Constitution, rule of law, and good governance, which is seen as a way to root out corruption. Be considerate of others and shun personal popularity is sort of one of the criteria in the National Ethics Committee. Able to strengthen the union, peace, unity, and national cohesion. So these are used now as sort of official ways that the Central Committee can reject certain candidates that it thinks don't reach a certain bar. But of course, what's become more influential in this system over time is this idea of networking and financial influence. Particularly relevant as the political economy in Tanzania has really changed since multipartyism, with economic liberalization, with a lot more private wealth. But I would argue that this has been, as much as it's been influential, it's been much less successful at shaping the outcome than one might assume. And it's the idea of building networks within the party Congress, within the National Executive Committee, sometimes using outright vote buying to secure your selection in office. And so let's see how this kind of looks in practice a little bit, just in kind of looking back at history. So let's look at the 1995 selection that brought Benjamin Mkapa to office, and the 2005 election that brought Jakaya Kikwete to office. So in 1995, there were 17 candidates. You had these sort of norms in the final selection. There was a mainlander and a Zanzibari. You had the youth candidate. In 1995, Kikwete was the youth candidate that was nominated, very popular. There was signaling involved in it too. Edward Lowassa, if people are familiar, is a very controversial figure in Tanzania. He'll come up again in 2015, was likely blocked by Nyerere from making it through the Central Committee. He was one of the 17 candidates. But there was also a really strong role for rules here. In 1995, there was real uncertainty over who the final candidate would be. Even though Nyerere publicly endorsed Benjamin Mkapa as well, there was a month of campaigning. It had to go to a second ballot. Nobody could secure a majority in the first round in the party Congress. And the second ballot was very close, 686 to 638 for Mkapa over Kikwete. And so the informal norm where Kikwete was sort of told to bide his time and that he could nominate himself again and he'd be the front runner in 2005. And so this really, in a sense, stabilized the factions in Tanzania, kind of real evidence of how succession really stabilizes this sort of competition within a regime. But it also, again, shows the failure of, again, it's going to come up again, of networking and financial appeals, because Kikwete had a lot of backing from the emerging sort of financial networks of Edward Lowassa at the time, and it failed to secure his nomination. 2005, when Kikwete comes to office, you have 11 candidates. Again, these norms, Kikwete was sort of the candidate who was groomed informally to be the front runner. There was signaling. Benjamin Mkapa endorsed Kikwete as his successor. There were rules that were put in place, a vote. And this was sort of the election where people thought, oh, here's where that network and that financial influence was at play, because Kikwete had spent those 10 years building a relationship with financial backers, primarily Edward Lowassa. He had run they'd run a smear campaign against one of the other candidates, Salim Ahmed Salim. And so one argument about the 2005 election was this was the success of the financial network, of this type of factionalism, of this type of influence that erodes the official rules of how presidents are succeeded in the party. But I actually see evidence for the other story as well, is that Kikwete was a very popular candidate in 2005. He had run in 1995. He had been groomed as a successor from Mkapa for 10 years. And so it's likely that he would have won that election even without that sort of nefarious network behind him kind of eroding those official rules. He won 1,000 of the party National Congress votes compared to 476 for Salim Ahmed Salim. So that brings us to Magufuli at 2015, which is the case that I actually think proves the rule that the party rules really matter in CCM. Prior to Magufuli's election, there was evidence of growing factionalism, really kind of controversial public corruption scandals, and a real threat of opposition unity in the 2015 election. But through that nomination process, which in 2015 initially had 42 candidates competing for president, you had norms as well in the Central Committee decision. January Makamba this time was selected as the youth candidate. You also had rules being implemented, a warning issued by the Central Committee of the party against people who started to campaign early, and a bit of sanction. And now you had these new review criteria from the Ethics Committee, which was used to justify basically excluding most of the candidates associated with any of the overt factions in CCM, with any of the financial interest in CCM, by excluding them from those final 5 and leaving Magufuli as sort of the surprise, unexpected consensus candidate. And so again, it's evidence that networking and financial influence really failed in this instance to secure the nomination, in this case for Edward Lowassa, who by all reports had spent millions of dollars to secure like 750,000 signatures and endorsements when it only needed 450. There was talk about briefcases of money at the National Congress of the party that Lowassa would use, and that ultimately failed to elevate somebody like Magufuli as the final candidate. The rules were actually in the final vote in the National Executive Committee, again, there's 300 people, people don't realize that vote was really close as well. Magufuli only got 290 of those votes, and Amina Salum Ali got 284, so there was a 6-vote difference between the two. So both kind of very popular candidates. And so that brings sort of Magufuli to the office, which to me is the victory of the party really over the victory of the factions. And then you have to understand Magufuli as, the bulldozer, as a strong arm way to rein in that factionalism that had shaped the 2015 election, and that he viewed as that type of factionalism, that type of overt corruption that had threatened to defeat CCM in 2015 as well. And so Magufuli was willing to use his power as party chairman, his power as the president in ways that his predecessors were really unwilling to do in order to accomplish a number of tasks with a lot of zeal. An anti-corruption effort. In his first day in office, the report is that he went to the Ministry of Finance to see who actually showed up for work. State-led nationalist development at the expense of scaring away foreign investors and limiting foreign investment in Tanzania. A reassertion of the party's power over its factions and over the nomination process. Magufuli passed a number of constitutional reforms to CCM that reduced membership in the National Executive Committee, that gave a constituency Congress more control over primaries. He replaced the Secretary General with an ally. He issued sort of disciplinary action against a number of prominent elites in CCM who were perceived as oppositional as part of that factionalism. And later he rehabilitated people. He brought them back into the fold, including people like Edward Lowassa from 2015. And of course, all this comes with a high dose of overt authoritarianism as well. That's well documented from the 2015 Statistics Act, the 2015 Cyber Crimes Act, and of course, a lot of overt repression of journalists, assassination attempts, all the stuff that's been heavily reported. But all that is done in Magufuli's mind to reassert CCM's image and reassert its control over these factions, which he saw as actually destabilizing to the party and to the long-term stability of CCM. Which brings us, and I'm going to conclude here, I don't have, with Suluhu, which I, as the unexpected sort of successor, but what matters here? Well, I think the personality does matter here. Issues of gender aside, actually, because I don't actually have much to say about that. I'll leave that sort of Q&A. She is a much more of a conciliatory figure who can mend some of the relationships that Magufuli really burned with other members of the party, with the opposition, with international actors. And I think that matters. I think you're going to see a change in tone, a decline in some of the levels of polarization. You've already seen signals from some of the major opposition figures in Tanzania that view Suluhu as a possible conciliatory figure. I think it's also likely that she pares back on some of the excesses of the Magufuli era, starting already with the response to COVID-19, maybe a little bit with treatment opposition, maybe with relationship to foreign investors. Yesterday, she gave a speech where she basically endorsed recognizing Bitcoin as an official currency in Tanzania, a cryptocurrency. So I think you're likely to see some of that. But I think there are a number of big questions. Because Suluhu was not elected in the same manner as other presidential candidates, does that present a problem for her as president going forward? Even though she ended up getting the endorsement of the Central Committee and the Party National Congress. Now, she is not associated with any of the major factions in CCM. She's not, she doesn't have that background. And that way she's similar to Magufuli. But she also doesn't have a natural political constituency in Tanzania. She's a Zanzibari too, that also provides a kind of a moment of weakness for her at the time. She doesn't necessarily have the loyalty of some of the Magufuli era elites. And she's actually recently reached out to Jakaya Kikwete for support, which would suggest that she might loosen some of that centralized control that Magufuli really inserted into CCM, that reassertion of the party. And so the question is she going to be as willing as Magufuli to rein in the excesses of factionalism? Or are we going to see a revival of factionalism? So I put that as a question mark as there. But on the other hand, she does have the support of some key party elites now. And because of her more neutral background, in a sense, she's also the new consensus candidate. In that way, similar to Magufuli, but able to, again, to pare back on some of the excesses of the Magufuli era. Then she's likely to also be the candidate in 2025 and likely the winner of that nomination in 2025, or even go uncontested in 2025 when she comes up from re-election. And in this role, she plays that similar role to Magufuli, that Magufuli, again, was actually kind of a stabilizing role for that factionalism that had emerged within CCM by reasserting the rules, the primacy of the party over the nomination process versus sort of funny business factionalism, kind of financial networking. I also, though, think that some of the bigger issues at foot are still there. There's no getting around that many of Magufuli's policies are incredibly popular in Tanzania, and that the opposition gained ground in 2015 in important ways that really scared CCM. So come 2025, the ability of the opposition to frame some sort of anti-Suluhu, anti-CCM message is going to be critical. But it does mean that for the moment, it doesn't seem like CCM has much incentive to veer that much off the path that Magufuli set in place starting in 2015, which is a strong dose, again, of state-led nationalist kind of development, a strong anti-corruption drive, a reassertion of the power of the party over its internal factions and over corruption. And so I think you're likely to see, despite some of the paring back of some of the rhetoric, some movement on things like, the COVID relief, still staying that sort of course till 2025. So I frame this all as question marks because all this is very near term. So I think it'd be foolish for me to put some sort of clear confidence interval about what the future of this presidency looks like. But I do think if we understand some of these behind the scene processes in CCM, it helps us understand that there's a real chance that there's a slight revival of the factionalism at CCM, but there's also a real chance that Suluhu emerges as a real consensus candidate in the Magufuli vein that helps rein some of that in a bit more and actually helps provide more legs to CCM. So I've probably gone over Hangala over my 15 minutes.
Thank you very much for that, Jonathan. I think you gave a lot of information, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of feedback in the Q&A. But yeah, for now, I think we can move on to Ken, who will be talking about the role of ideology in turnover in Ethiopia and beyond. Ken, over to you.
All right. Thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you to UCT for inviting me to this discussion. So today I'm going to have a discussion about Ethiopia, which is currently going through a bit of a political rough patch with conflict in Tigray, which is occupying a lot of the headline real estate right now, but many other conflicts, all around Ethiopia. And the way I see these conflicts is through the lens of the lasting impact of Ethiopia's historical commitment to the idea of ethno-national self-determination at the subnational level, which has always been in constant conflict with the tendency of the federal government in Addis Ababa, or the imperial government, or the military government in between, to centralize authority in Addis. So there are conflicts in the subnational ethnic states, with more people wanting to have their own ethno-national states, or disputes over boundaries, whether it's between the Amhara region and Tigray, Amhara and Oromia, conflicts in Somaliland, and even more conflict in the multi-ethnic states. Now, how do we and should we understand this in the context of the transitions that Ethiopia has seen since 2012 with the death of Meles Zenawi? To understand this, Lahra Smith and I recently wrote a paper on the power of ideology in shaping Ethiopia's political development, basically over the last 70 years or so. And so, to try and make sense of what happened in 2012 with the transition from Meles Zenawi to Desalegn Haile Mariam, and then in 2018 from Haile Mariam to Prime Minister Abiy, we looked at this question of what kind of coalition governed Ethiopia in the post-conflict era, right? And that coalition and the ideology underpinning it actually goes way back to the 60s. And in order to understand why the decisions were made in specific decisions and choices were made in 2012 and 2018, we need to understand the factors at play and how they condition the choice set available to the EPRDF, the governing coalition, during both transitions. So Yoni has talked at length about institutions and term limits and how they condition elite political behavior in the specific case of Tanzania, right? And what we do is ask the question in the paper of how and why are those institutions sticky, right? And we can start off with the case, say, of Magufuli. Observers of Tanzania were very nervous that come 2025, there's a real possibility that Magufuli would have tried to tinker with term limits in Tanzania. Right, therefore running roughshod of the party and its established tradition of this 2-year term limit. Right, I think that maybe the party would have triumphed in the end, right? CCM was fairly factionalized, and even though Magufuli had done a pretty good job from his perspective of centralizing party control during his first 5 years in office, removing term limits would have been too heavy a lift. Other institutions like the military and the former presidents perhaps may have weighed in. However, presidents across the continent have been able to do this. So why is it that in some places, elites have agreed to these bargains that outlast individual ambition and kind of override these factional politics that exist within states? So that's one question that we pose in the paper, and we go back and make the argument that history matters. Historical experiences matters, how people perceive politics and what is legitimate political action matters in shaping both elite and mass incentives. And I'll come back to that in a bit. Second, we observe that turnover is actually very risky, right? And especially if you have a president who's been in office for a long time, right? Changing a president often means completely changing coalitions. Again, I'll use the example of Tanzania since we've just talked about Tanzania. Magufuli completely disrupted the Kikwete clientelist network in Tanzania with his anti-corruption drive. President Samia Suluhu Hassan will definitely disrupt the Magufuli network, right? She wants to establish herself as her own president. And we've seen examples of this in Botswana with Ian Khama's successor disrupting his networks, in Angola with Dos Santos' successor, in Mozambique, right, in the DRC, right? So presidents cannot always trust that their successors will continue their legacy. And elites around presidents cannot always trust that their successors will continue their legacy. And so in many ways, right, the risk of transition creates this very strong status quo bias in keeping presidents in place, because even if the president may want to leave office, right, or may be forced to leave office, elites around them may want them around in order to maintain the networks and not lose connections to government. And I think, this may partially explain some, stalled transitions like, in Cameroon or Uganda, right? Examples where, the failure to transition, right? Yes, it could be, it's predominantly explained by the person at the top, right, and the incentives, but there's a partial sort of explanation around the fact that elites cannot coalesce around a viable successor, which means that the status quo that then holds on. So then, how do countries overcome, this very strong status quo bias against presidential transition? And in the case of Ethiopia, right, we make the case that when you're thinking about changing the head of government, there's a, as a default, there's a very strong status quo bias. And in order to overcome that status quo bias, institutions may not be enough. Elections and competitiveness may not be enough, because elections can always be rigged. Term limits can be abolished, right? So you need something more to hold elites accountable to their commitments. And so we rest on ideology. And what we do in the paper is go back to the 1960s, when Ethiopia basically emerges in its open politics era, if you will. So a quick brief history of Ethiopia. In the 30s, the Emperor Haile Selassie begins this big modernization exercise. Ethiopia gets its first constitution, a parliament. It tries to work as a constitutional monarchy. World War II happens. Mussolini occupies Ethiopia. The Brits come and dislodge the Italians. The Brits then run Eritrea for 10 years. From 43 to 53, after which Eritrea is made into a federation with Ethiopia. Now that then, kindles what had always been some anti-centralization sentiment within Ethiopia, going back to the late 19th century, of the different ethnic groups in Ethiopia, but particularly Eritrea, and Tigray, which regions that did not like Amhara domination of the Ethiopian state. This also is happening in the context of decolonization all around Africa. And part of the drive is then taken on by student movements. And the student movements at first have this very sort of Marxist, Leninist, class-based sort of conceptualization of Ethiopian politics. But then Emperor Haile Selassie tries very hard to centralize the Ethiopian state. He abrogates the federal structure with Eritrea, which then begins to feel this idea that in order to fully free Ethiopia, Ethiopia's nations and nationalities should run their own affairs, right? Kind of in the mold of what Lenin had, the idea that Lenin had for Russia, Imperial Russia, that the different nations, ethnicities, and nationalities within the Soviet Empire could run their own affairs. So the idea gains currency. Identity replaces class as sort of the main driving force of Ethiopian politics. The student movement then takes on the idea of giving land back to the tiller, that is dislodging these old imperial overlords who had pretty much run a feudal system on top of the Ethiopian state, and then giving the different ethnic nations and nationalities autonomy over their own subnational affairs. That student movement causes so much disruption that the 74 coup happens. Imperial government is taken out of office. The Darg regime styles itself as a Marxist-Leninist regime to ride the student movement wave, but it quickly goes back to the bad old habits of centralizing control. Right, and the net effect of that was to create these sort of ethnic liberation fronts that characterize the Ethiopian civil war. So everyone who could had their own, Oromo Liberation Front, the Somali Liberation Front, the Eritrea Liberation Front, the Tigray People's Liberation Front. So all these liberation fronts, right, they have an ethnic character. TPLF and the Eritreans become the dominant faction that actually wins the war in 1991. And because of that history, right, and especially within TPLF, its own commitment to ethno-national self-determination as an ideological sort of force, and there are great books and papers that have been written on TPLF and how the TPLF leadership actually walked the talk as far as ideology and organization went. Their hands were tied, right? They had fought this war for a long time, making the claim that they were against centralization and that Ethiopia was better run if the different nations and nationalities within Ethiopia avoided centralized Amhara domination by running their own affairs. So the constitutional settlement in the post-war period, right, has this very ethnic character. Ethiopia, the TPLF elite, they have to commit to potentially giving Eritrea independence, which happens. And for what is left of Ethiopia, they also have to commit to this ethno-national self-determination at the subnational level. So that is reflected in the constitutional settlement. But more importantly, for our purposes today, it's reflected in the structure of the ruling party, the EPRDF. Right, so Ethiopia comes out of the war not with a national sort of mass mobilization party, but as an alliance of ethnic parties led by the TPLF. And the Amhara region comes in with their own organization, created and definitely dominated by TPLF. The Oromia region has its own political formation. The Southern peoples also have their own political formations, and these four dominate EPRDF, but there's always this sense that, this is not an apex national party that has direct reach to the electorate. Instead, it has an indirect reach to the electorate through these constituent parts. And that's what really ties the hands of the elite when the transition begins to loom on everyone, right? So even before Meles died in 2012, there had always been talk about a transition. In fact, in an interview before Meles' death, Haile Mariam, who succeeded Meles, right, openly said that, yes, we have been thinking about transition within the EPRDF. And that transition was always going to be out of TPLF, because this was an ethnic alliance, whose elites had, committed to walking the talk on ideology. The party could not succeed Meles by electing another elite from the Tigray region to run the Ethiopian federal government. And so, when the transition came about, it was quite obvious that the successor to Meles was not going to be another Tigrayan. Now, back to 2005, when Ethiopia tried to open up to electoral politics, right, the EPRDF quickly found out that it wasn't as popular as it thought, especially in the Oromia region, which comprises about 40% of Ethiopians. And so this created a challenge for the party. And as discontent spread, and discontent particularly against the grand domination of the center, you had this greater push for subnational autonomy, especially in Oromia and Amhara regions, right? And that sort of movement was briefly stalled with the 2015 election, which was properly rigged to keep out the opposition, to project this sense that EPRDF was still dominant, but came to a head in 2018 when the party couldn't contain the mass protests. And so, Haile Mariam had to go. He had become unpopular. He was seen as a stooge for the TPLF, who were actually still in power. Then, the party's hands were tied, right? They couldn't elect an Amhara because the Amharas had run Ethiopia for a very long time under the imperial regime. It was obvious that the successor to Haile Mariam had to be someone from OPDO, the Oromia party, right? And so that's how, the options were very limited for the party, and in comes Abiy as a chosen successor to Haile Mariam, both to please the Oromo faction within EPRDF, but also to signal that the alliance is still a national alliance, as opposed to a TPLF sort of dominated entity. And this sort of surprise succession, right, gives us a surprise prime minister, who quickly then moves to become his own man, right? He goes as far as, in my view, abrogating this sort of ethno-national self-determination bargain by trying to form a unified national party, as opposed to maintaining the mode of an alliance of different ethnic parties. And it is that move that basically spooked the TPLF elite and forced them to make the decisions that they made, which in conjunction with the Prime Minister's own choices led us to the current open conflict in the Tigray region. And so I see the Tigray conflict as basically a response to Abiy's attempts to re-centralize the state, especially through the party. In the paper, and I would encourage us all to read the paper if you have a chance, we make the case that, this was not just a case of the Prime Minister wanting to do politics differently, right? The EPRDF as a party always had central sort of dominance of the Ethiopian state. But the fact that it was a coalition of parties allowed a modicum of independence for these subnational sort of ethnic entities to run their own affairs. The states run their own police forces and all manner of services that gave them some autonomy from the center. But the attempt to re-centralize the party signaled a departure from this bargain, which then created incredible amounts of instability for the Ethiopian state. Because, the TPLF called the bluff and chose to create a constitutional crisis by forcing an election which the center did not recognize, and which in the end resulted in the current conflict. So just to conclude, I think, Ethiopia tells us a story that about political development in Africa more broadly that we've often not looked at very closely, right? We've gone, thankfully, we've gone from a world where we used to conceptualize African politics as, 100% personality, to a world where we care about institutions and parties and how they constrain elite action, right? As Yoni pointed out in the case of CCM in Tanzania, and you can see it all over the place, right? Tanzania, I would argue, also has some ideology in there, right? If you look at the parties that have managed internal succession, even under authoritarian rule, they're parties that have had a history of ideological indoctrination of the elite class. So if you look at, MPLA in Angola, if you look at Frelimo in Mozambique, right, the ANC in South Africa, the CCM, right, these are parties that have gone through trials of different kinds, and then through those trials created an ideology that kept elites united and therefore able to have the party override individual ambition within them. And those countries and parties, right, stand apart from highly personalist regimes like in Uganda or Rwanda or Cameroon, whose autocracy has not created room for internal autocratic succession. And the person of the president still dominates the party. I'll stop there and look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you very much, Ken. That really complemented very well what Yonatan shared. I think we'll hold the question for later, but for now we have a final presentation from Michael. Michael, we give you 15 minutes, and then I hope everybody can begin to prepare their question immediately after Michael is there. You're on mute, Michael. You're on mute, Michael.
All right, there we go. So first of all, I'd like to thank the Institute for letting me present here, and Hangala particularly for sharing, and I'm in such wonderful company in this panel. I wanted to talk about the Malawi transition, but I would like to focus on one particular aspect of the Malawi transition, and also because I think ties in very nicely to the recent transition in Tanzania with President Suluhu. So the interesting thing with both of these transitions, of course, is that a male president dies in office. And as a consequence of a male president dying in office, both countries get their first female president. And what I'm going to talk about here is what can we expect from a transition like this? Can we expect female empowerment by accident? And I'm going to focus particularly on the Malawian case. Now, just as a start, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what could be different between the Malawian case and the Tanzanian case, I wanted to show a little bit about what President Banda herself said about the recent events in Tanzania. I had the opportunity to interview her for a blog post at the Democracy in Africa blog. And very clearly, as you will see in this short clip, President Banda finds quite a bit of relations with the Tanzanian president.
It's difficult, but one thing about female leaders, and I think you should watch the Tanzanian president, what she's doing. That is characteristic of female leaders. Female leaders get into leadership and they're decisive and they are brave and they take risks and they want to do just what is right, regardless of what risk it is or regardless of what the potential backlash that you might get. But as I said earlier, if you fell in love with the people you serve, you don't care. What you know is that you should do things right.
So let's talk a little bit about the context in which President Banda becomes the president. And you will see that there are certain similarities maybe with Tanzania, but also much that is quite different. So Banda becomes the president on 7th of April in 2012. And this is when her predecessor, Bingu Mutharika, dies in office about halfway into the presidential term. When she becomes the president, she becomes the first ever female president in Malawi and the second one on the African continent after Liberia. She comes into office under very difficult circumstances. There is great elite resistance to her presidency. At the time that Mutharika dies in office, Banda has already deserted the president's party and has built her own party, the People's Party. People around Mutharika, including his brother, who later became the president, Arthur Peter Mutharika, tries to prevent her from constitutionally taking office. It was only because of the military stepping in that the constitution could be restored and she could take up the presidency. As she comes into the presidency, she does so in a situation with a very deep economic crisis, arguably the worst since the introduction of multipartism in Malawi. There was a very deep economic crisis with fuel shortage, foreign currency shortage. There was a significant democracy and human rights crisis. Just before this transition, there had been increases in repression, including a very famous incident when police shot at demonstrators and killed 11 Malawians. And there was also a diplomatic crisis with donors reacting strongly to both corruption and to the democracy and human rights crisis, and where many of the most important donors had suspended all bilateral aid to Malawi. So this is the context in which Banda becomes president. She's also politically very weak because she had defected from the government party. Her own party had very little strength in parliament and was also organizationally very shallow. So the big question is, can a woman president elected under such precarious circumstances actually serve to advance women politically more generally? If we look at the literature on Malawi particularly, the general answer seems to be no. So if we look at what happened during the Banda period, a lot of authors have pointed to the limited impact of the Banda presidency for female political empowerment. So Banda's popularity dropped very drastically in her term, as shown in Afrobarometer data, and she was resoundingly voted out of office in 2014. She was also highly blamed for a big corruption scandal, which has been popularly labeled the Cashgate corruption scandal, although the scandal involved multiple governments. And maybe because of these two things, the lowering popularity of Joyce Banda and the big Cashgate scandal, we saw for the first time since the introduction of multipartism in 1994 that the number of women in Malawi parliament declined. And some authors like Shikapa has argued that this could be seen as a Banda effect, where female politicians sort of were blamed by association with Banda. But the argument that I am going to make here is a much more positive one. And rather than looking at parliament, at the election of female MPs, I'm going to look at what is the consequence of the Banda presidency in inspiring female leadership in parliament. And I'm drawing here on a recently published article in the latest issue of the American Political Science Review, which I've co-authored with two of my current or former grad students, Nicholas Franciscakis and Murat Yildirim. So just to give you some background, around the world, women are taking up more seats in parliament. And actually the development has been quite rapid. But women still face obstacles in obtaining power within these legislative institutions. So there's a large literature about the discrimination and harassment that women face in parliament. And we also know that they tend to have a slower career advancement and lack of key appointments as compared to male MPs. Hassim made, I think, the very convincing argument that we need to separate between thin and thick representation. So thin representation would be the mere presence of women, women as some sort of token, whereas thick representation means that women are granted real voice and leadership within parliamentary institutions. And it's really key to make this distinction, because thick representation will really be necessary in order to translate that increased descriptive representation to real substantive representation. And women do not access leadership in parliament. It doesn't really matter to the same extent how many women are in parliament. So one very important metric that we can use to sort of proxy thick representation is parliamentary speech making. And there has been research, particularly from Western Europe, looking at gender patterns in speech making within parliament. And what this research has shown, even from very gender equal societies such as Sweden, is that women are much less likely to participate in parliamentary debates than men. And they tend to be more confined to speaking on issues that have often traditionally been seen as female, such as healthcare and education, but less so on the traditional male spheres, such as defense, foreign policy, and maybe most importantly, the economy. So the two questions that I'm going to ask in the empirical part of this presentation is, can a female president increase female speech making? And can a female president increase female speech making on traditional male topics? And I'm going to look especially at the economy. So we argue that there could really be a very strong argument to assume that a female president will have this effect. And we particularly look at the symbolic representation literature. I saw that Gretchen Bauer is in this presentation. She has made a lot of contributions to this literature. So we think about symbolic representation as altering gendered ideas about the role of women and men in politics, raising awareness of what women can do as political actors, and legitimize them as political agents. So according to this idea, lack of female representation is not only a cause of or an effect of gender inequalities, but can also perpetuate them by creating certain images of what women should and should not do in public life. So why do we think that there could be a symbolic effect of a female president on female parliamentary behavior? Well, we particularly look at three potential mechanisms. First of all, it should normalize the presence of women in political power. And this should be true even though the female president may not have been elected. It will also alter the stereotypes about appropriate behavior. So we know from the literature that certain types of very assertive behavior can often backfire on female politicians that have often been expected to be more timid in their role, which could also limit their ability to take up leadership and speak in parliament. And it should create a general momentum for women in politics. So the data that I'm going to use to analyze this question is data that I collected in the Parliamentary Library in Lilongwe several years ago. It's a complete set of the Hansard from Malawi in the period 1999 to 2014. We used these data and we used supervised machine learning to code all the speeches in this period. It's about 110,000 speeches. And from that, we could code the number of speeches that each MP gave, and also the number of speeches that each MP gave on the topic of the economy. I think the nice part about this research design, and this will also adhere to, as we think about Tanzania, is that Banda's accent to power is in many ways exogenous to increased gender equality. So often when we see a woman becoming a president, it's because society is already becoming more accepting against women in public life. But here she became president by an accident. Similarly, given that there was no parliamentary election in the period 2009 to 2014, we can compare the exact same MPs in the parliamentary term where we had a male president as in the parliamentary term where we had a female president. So I'm going to show you some results from some regression models where I'm particularly interested in seeing does the effect of being a female change from the Mutharika period, where you had the male president, to the Banda period, where we had the female president. And I control for a number of variables, including how long you've been in parliament, whether you're a senior MP, partisanship, and so on. So first, just to show you how big of a difference this seems to have been made. So what you see here is the female to male speech ratio in the Malawi parliament during first the Mutharika period, and then the Banda period. So during the Mutharika period, the ratio hovered around about 50 to 60%, meaning that the average female MP gave only 60% as many speeches as the average male MP. So this is a very important and substantial difference. But when Banda becomes president, this ratio goes up to 80%, around 80%. meaning that the average female MP spoke about 80% as much as male MPs. So this is a very important and substantial difference. And if we look into the models, we can find two important findings. First of all, female MPs spoke significantly more during Banda than they did during Mutharika. And whereas in the Mutharika period, there was a statistically significant difference between male and female MPs, this was no longer true in the Banda period. There could be a number of alternative explanations. In the paper, we go into these in some detail. It could be that women speak more later on in the parliamentary term, but this is not the case. This was not true in the 1999 and 2004 parliament. It could be that it's a party leader rather than a president effect, but this is also not true because we see the same effect in the DPP and the MCP, the two main opposition parties. And thirdly, we discussed the possibility that there could be a backlash as Banda's popularity starts to drop. But this is, again, not something we find. Even if we look before or after Cashgate, we see the same effect. So, to conclude, some seem to have argued that women presidents do not do much for female empowerment, but our findings are really much more optimistic. And I think for us who are researchers who might be interested in the issues of women in politics, it's important that to realize that the President Hassan's presidency really opens up some very interesting opportunities for research on gender and politics. And as we start to look at those things, it might be meaningful to look beyond the most obvious metrics, such as will the number of female MPs increase, but also look at other potential metrics. Speech making could be one of them. So I am going to conclude there, and thank you so much for your attention.
Oh, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you very much to all three of you, Yonatan, Ken. Yep, I think you all give different perspectives. You know, Yonatan on Tanzania, Ken on Ethiopia, and Michael on Malawi. So we can open it up now. I think we can take 3 questions at one go and allow the panel to respond to the question. Do we have any hand? You can either use the hand feature or type a message in the chat room. Okay, perhaps while we wait for a question, I think I have one for Ken. You talked a lot about ideology playing an important role in how succession is managed in Ethiopia. But from what I heard you explain, I got the impression that it's really more of ethnic identity or ethnic balancing that's really the determining factor. Could you perhaps maybe speak to that?
Yes. So the reason why we think that it's not simply ethnic politics is that we've seen this play out elsewhere on the continent, right? So in a typical sort of ethnicity-based balancing, where it's just a matter of having the right number of ethnic groups or representation of specific ethnic groups, it's often very easy to abrogate those agreements, right? And then give the aggrieved ethnic groups other payoffs, other side payments. So in Ethiopia, for instance, it would have been very easy for a TPLF prime minister to stay in office while appointing ever more cabinet ministers from the SAPDM or the Oromia region, right? Because that's often how African presidents have managed to maintain ethnic alliances. Yet, you know, the power of ideology was that, you know, average Ethiopians, and thank God the Afrobarometer data is finally out for the last round, so I've been playing around with it, seeing, you know, support for ethnic federalism. A majority of Ethiopians, about 55%, still very strongly support this notion of ethnic federalism. And even those that don't, you know, still have some preference for some subnational autonomy. fearing this central domination. So both among the masses and within the elite class, there's this belief that, centralization under imperial Amhara domination was bad. To keep Ethiopia as a stable state, there needs to be subnational autonomy, especially in the 4 dominant regions of Oromia, Amhara, Tigray, and the Somali region. And that sort of drove politics above and beyond just ethnic power sharing, which could have happened with a TPLF, a Tigrayan in charge, with ever more cabinet positions or other side payments to the other ethnic groups.
Yep, thank you very much for clarifying that, Ken. We've got 2 questions, one from Consolata and Monte Bakachi. Maybe we can begin with Consolata, then after that, Monte can ask a question. Feel free to turn on your camera and ask the question.
Hello.
Hi, Consolata, can you hear you?
Yes, I just have a few observations on Yonatan's presentation. I'll just try to turn on my video if it works, because my internet is a little bit down. Okay, here. Right. I'm Consolata from the University of Dar es Salaam, and I am very happy to be part of this. A few observations on Yonatan's presentation. One, I think you need to note that we don't have uniform nomination system in Tanzania. So when you say Tanzania's presidential nomination system, then it sounds like you're trying to generalize while you're actually referring to CCM's nomination system. So I think that is one note that you need to you take. And then secondly, on what determines the outcome of the national nominations in Tanzania, you mentioned that network and money have less influence in the outcome. Yes, I agree, partly. Depends on which nomination you are referring to, whether it is in the 1995, 2005, or 2015. Because if you talk about the 1995, then you see less influence, yes, because the area was very. But when you talk about the nation that saw Kikwete being nominated, I think network and money played a great role. And then when you come to the 2015 nominations, yes, network and money did not work. And it was for purpose. Of course, if you ask CCM elites, they would say that they try to control factions within the party, which you correctly stated. But we have
Okay, I think Consolata's
to also remember that in 2000 bent purposely to functionalities that rely. Yes.
Okay, yeah, you're breaking there. Maybe just try to wrap up the question so that we can, yeah.
Yes, maybe I should just turn off my video because it will help. Yeah, so I was just saying that in 2005, some of the rules were bent. CCM used security and ethics committee to actually rob the powers of the central committee to nominate the 5 nominees. And therefore, that is why the likes of the Lowassa and other strong personalities were written off from the process. So I think those are just a few observations that I wanted to note on Yonatan's presentation. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. We can take 2 more quick questions, one from Monte and followed by Gretchen Bauer. And then after that, we can allow the panel to reply to all 3.
First of all, greetings from downtown Toronto. And I thank all of the speakers in terms of what they have advanced. My question is basically a simple question, and for that, I apologize. I am seeking from you, what do you ascribe as being the fundamental transactional takeaway from your insightful investigative analysis in terms of what I would call the transactionality in political social publics, in terms of adding positive to the conversation in political publics? I thank you.
Gretchen? You're on mute. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I hope it's okay. I actually have more of a comment or a couple of comments than a question, and directed, of course, to Michael's paper, which I really enjoyed and really liked a lot. And I'd just like to mention that one of the things I say a lot in my own work is that at some level, symbolic representation effects of more women, in politics can be even more important than the substantive representation effects, right? Especially in African cases where legislatures are so weak, right? And so this is just, maybe a little more evidence of what you're also arguing. And I think, if you look at Jenny Burnett's work in Rwanda, she finds the same thing in terms of, women in communities feeling that they can speak up more because they have women representing them in parliament. I've experienced the same thing in conversations with women in Tanzania. And then I was also thinking that, I like the way you say, let's look at this same question in Tanzania. Of course, it may be even more so the case, right, because there has been such a high representation of women in parliament in Tanzania for a longer period of time. And, for anybody who's going to do this work, I would suggest looking at Mi Young Yoon's work, right? She's been working on women in parliament for a long time in Tanzania, and she has identified what she says is, changes in parliamentary culture and women speaking up more and the like. So that would also be important. And then finally, I think, I wonder if we won't see more, parties and presidential candidates thinking a bit harder about who their vice presidential candidate is now that this has happened 2 times, right? Because in both cases, there was a hesitation, right, before anybody could say, yes, this woman really is the next president. And so, yeah, those were just some comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gretchen. I think we can respond to that in the order of the presentation. So you can, from the question, pick what you want to reply to. And then after that, I know we have at least one more question in the chat, and we'll probably wrap it up after that. So Yonatan, we can start with you.
Okay, thank you, Consolata and Monte. And also, I saw Jeremy's question in the chat too. So maybe my answer maybe tie all 3 questions sort of together. For Consolata, I'm only talking about CCM's nomination process. And I don't disagree at all that networking and sort of financial maneuvering has increasingly played a role. Now, when it comes to 2005, I think, again, there's a mixed story there. There was this large financial network, this nexus of Rostam Aziz, Kikwete, and Edward Lowassa. But there's also another side to that story, is that Kikwete was also a clear frontrunner in 1995. And there was sort of this informal Norman discussion within the party that he was the natural candidate for 2005. And so there was consensus even absent of that financial networking. And when you look at the other 2 people who were nominated, I think it was Salim Ahmed Salim by that time was quite an elder statement. He had refused to run in 85, he had refused to run in 95, then he comes out in 2005. It was clear he had lost a lot of support within the party. And Mark Mangose, who was the Minister of Transportation, was the other candidate, I believe, in 2005. But yeah, the network, I'm saying, it's not saying it doesn't have an influence and increasing an influence. And I think it ties in also to Monty's question and Jeremy's question and kind of Ken's presentation, is that institutions can become very contested arenas where you have process and proceduralism coming face to face with factionalism, with personal networks. And it's a question of how these things get resolved. To Ken's point, also, like, he talked about ideology as sort of this glue. And I think that's totally true. And then when it comes to Tanzania, though, I would add a couple of other things. As one is that when you have layers of proceduralism, and we look outside of just the presidential succession, the way CCM is set up as a party, the way decision-making happens in that party, it'd be very difficult to change term limits in Tanzania. I think Magufuli even withdrew from that idea by 2019 of the idea of changing term limits. versus in the CPDM in Cameroon, it's an up and down vote in the National Congress. There really is no National Congress. There really is no procedure. It's whatever BIA really wants to happen and that National Congress happens. So that legacy of historical deliberation, those layers of proceduralism make a difference. So that influences the politics of term limits as well. And the other question is that as long as the process has some credibility to it, I think you get more elite buy-in to this system in the long term, and it makes it more difficult to overturn those type of things. And that's what Magufuli really faced in 2015 with this increasing factionalism, is that there was a core of elites within CCM who didn't like that factionalism. They felt that it was rigging the rules in their disfavor. And then when that happens, that can be very problematic for continuing term limits. When that credibility begins to erode and becomes a marketplace rather than a process, that becomes difficult. So that's to me is my way, kind of also my takeaway to kind of Monty's question of what's the one big kind of transactional takeaway, is that succession processes matter, and the balance between factionalism and institutionalization matters too.
Yeah, thank you. Ken, over to you.
Yeah, I'll start with Monty's question. And I think my main takeaway here is that when we think about political development in Africa over the last 30 years, right? There has been this underlying current of almost a Whiggish history of political development in Africa. Everyone is marching towards liberal democracy, which has not been borne out in the data, right? And I would urge us to pay a lot more attention to the processes of political development, as Yoni has very well put it. That the idea that we spent so much time thinking about whether elections are free and fair, and not enough time about the bolts and nuts about the process. All right, because it's once you figured out that process and there's buy-in into the process, then it's relatively easier to then open it up. All right, because then the infrastructure is in place. But without that, it's harder to democratize. If you look at democratic transitions, it's stable autocracy is often a good predictor of a more open, competitive politics, because the infrastructure was built during and institutionalization was built during the autocratic era. Which brings me to Jeremy's question. I think the politics of term limits and the politics of democratic governance in the region more generally will be dependent on how well publics perceive the systems to deliver for them. Because as we saw in the case of Ethiopia with Abiy's rise, right, he was so popular that he thought for a brief moment that he could rewrite the rules. Just like with Magufuli, he was so popular that for a brief moment, he thought he could rewrite the rules. And I'm working on a paper looking at Tanzanian data, and you see that people's perception of corruption on the Kikwete are very strong predictors of support for Magufuli and willingness to let Magufuli do whatever he wanted. All right, so African publics will continue voting for democracy and institutional and constitutional government as long as it delivers. If it's not delivering, just like we've seen with publics elsewhere, people will look for alternatives. So the challenge for democratizers and those of us who care about constitutional government is to work hard to make sure that these systems work, and that through process and longevity, both elites and the mass publics can accept them for what they are, and not constantly be battling to rewrite the rules as part of the game.
Thank you, Ken. Over to you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Gretchen, for great comments. I think most of them were comments, but your last one, I think, spurs a quite interesting question. And this is, given the experience we've had, I also studied Zambia, and of course, Hangala could say much more about that case. Vice presidents tend to be quite important, particularly in countries where presidents tend to be older and have had a tendency to die in office. And I think there's already, and I think that this might be seen as a Joyce Banda effect, there's already in the Malawi case strong evidence to suggest that vice presidents, how you think about them strategically, have become more important. So in the last election, the incumbent president, Arthur Peter Mutharika, picked a completely unknown running mate in 2019, that is. Before the election, there was a lot of rumors about him picking a much more colorful character, which is the son of the former president named Muluzi. This would be a person that could have added much more to that coalition. And indeed, probably if he picked Muluzi, which he then ended up doing in the 2020 rerun, if he would have done so already in 2019, he could probably have amassed enough of a margin to win that 2019 election and wouldn't have had to face the consequences of the court case. But he decided not to do so. Instead, he decided to pick a very loyal, kind of low profile running mate, because he was afraid that putting Muluzi into the tent would sort of transfer power if he would die from his winning coalition to another one, which the family had already fallen out with. So I think that there's already kind of increased understanding of that issue. So what are the main takeaways? I think there are many, but one of the things is that so far we have concentrated a lot on female parliamentary representation. And I am not saying that these things are not important, but there's also growing evidence to suggest that only putting more women in parliament does not necessarily solve a lot of the problems of political underrepresentation in a more kind of qualitative sense in any sort of political system. So I think what this research also suggests is that we must think much more about women not only being able to get into parliament, but also rising through the ranks, taking up more senior positions within parliament, within cabinet, and also for the presidency. And unfortunately, the way that we think about women in parliament in African politics has often been kind of defeatist in the sort of goals that have been set and so on. And then I have a question here from Jeremy as well. Why did it happen so suddenly? Well, yes, it is true that it happened very suddenly, and we didn't see much of a change over the Banda period. And actually what we see was a very quick symbolic effect. So we saw several speeches, and we took out several of them, with women actually using the parliamentary floor to sort of to declare victory and saying that this is a monumentous point in our history for women, and this is a cry to take up more space. So it seems like that symbolic effect was very sudden and happened quickly. The difference is not that men speak less often, in terms of frequency, they speak about as often, but we see more women taking up space on the parliamentary floor. There is one more that I haven't been able to read. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, that's an answer to those questions.
All right, and I think with that, thank you very much again to Yonatan, Ken, and Michael. We're about 10 minutes overboard, so I think we can bring it to an end. I think the important takeaway that we got from all three of our presenters is that, presidential succession is a very big deal. It has implications for democracy, but that will play out in different ways from one country to another. So we definitely look forward to learning more from the presenters in future, and I hope you all enjoy this particular presentation. So for me, it's good evening here from Cape Town, and I hope we can catch you when we have our next monthly webinar presentation sometime in July. So thank you very much, and have a good evening or good afternoon wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.